So it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Arik Reiss, who's come from New Zealand. And those of you who went to the film screening yesterday would probably recognise him as the director of Druglawed, the film that EGA showed. And he's also director of another film called Inside New Zealand, High Time. And he's working on his third film at the moment, which is Druglawed 2, the sequel. And Arik is talking today about the pathologisation of cannabis use in the mainstream media. And for those of you who might not know what that means, it's basically the way the media treats cannabis use like it's some kind of disease. And obviously this is a topic that he's been immersed in as he's been making his films most recently. So welcome, Arik.
Thanks.
Over to you, mate. Please give him a hand.
Thank you for having me. As the slides explain, I'm talking about the pathologization of cannabis, and I'm talking about, it's kind of a discourse analysis that I'm going to present so that you can learn the way the mainstream media are directing the narratives about drug use. And I'm talking about specifically about cannabis, but you could extrapolate what I'm saying to cover other drugs as well. And I'm going to have to lean forward every now and then to press play on this thing, just so if you're wondering why I'm doing that on the video. Okay, so there are common themes within the news media's reporting of drugs and crime. This presentation is intended to highlight some key themes within the news media's reporting of drug use and drug-related crime. Its aim is to focus on how the news media represent illegal drugs and drug users. The discourses of criminality, deviance, and laziness are the three most prevalent discourses. When I talk about deviance, you could also say insanity instead, because deviant people are deemed to be insane and insane people are deemed to be deviant. So there's kind of a convergence of deviance and insanity, and I use those terms almost interchangeably. News media and governmental beliefs mirror each other and have both adopted a stance that illicit drug use is dangerous and causes further criminality and deviance. It also asserts that both media coverage and policy direction are disproportionately aimed at specific stereotypes of drug users, to the point whereby simplistic notions have developed at the expense of a broader and more complex discussion, much to the detriment of a holistic drugs discourse. I'm going to get through a bit of academic stuff and then we'll get to the fun stuff. Now I'm also talking about advertising, so I'm looking at the discourses used within news media and also within advertising. And sometimes there's a convergence of these two, which I'll illustrate with the Reagan's Just Say No campaign, how the news and advertising were actually just co-opted into being the same thing. The presentation is intended to highlight key themes within the mainstream media's advertising representations of legal and illegal drug use. Legal drugs and drug use are positively represented, and illegal drug use and drug users are represented as being risk-bearing outsiders who are actively excluded from society, and representations of them in public service announcements are of the loser, the deviant, and the criminal, those three discourses. I won't get into Derrida, but this word is very useful, toxicomania, and it's a way of understanding how they're presenting these themes. It's all within the discourse of the toxicomaniac, that drug users are out of control and they crave their drugs, they'll kill for their drugs. When pushed to the extreme, that's very literally what is being sold to us. Now this video will contextualize the whole argument from its historical beginnings.
The roots of prohibition were intimately entwined with issues around race and immigration in the early part of last century. So it wasn't just Mexican immigrants and the economic depression and marijuana, it was also Asian immigrants and opiates, and there was also issues around Negroes and cocaine. There was a whole series of ways in which other drugs that weren't alcohol and tobacco were associated with horrible xenophobic attitudes towards different groups. So different groups were associated with different drugs, and scaremongering and fear and xenophobia around those groups and those drugs kind of went hand in hand. And the policy responses in terms of prohibitions and enforcement against those drugs became tools of oppression to express some of those racist, xenophobic attitudes. So authority used, various forms of authority used the the drug laws as a way of oppressing various groups that they didn't like or felt uncomfortable with for whatever reason.
Okay, so where all this became prevalent in the US's drug enforcement culture was through this man, Harry Anslinger. And if many of you have seen the movie, then I don't really have to break down what kind of a person he was. I actually recognize many of your faces, but for those who weren't at the movie yesterday, Harry Anslinger was really a psychopath. He basically hated the idea that the races were intermingling, specifically around the jazz era, and this was the first real instance of blacks and whites coming together and having a good time. And this sent shockwaves through the conservative white society of the time, and men like Anslinger had just vociferous hatred of this intermingling, particularly with the idea that black men were going to have sex with white women. And you see this again and again in the advertising of the time, the kind of the corruption of the previously chaste, innocent white girl is it's represented in the language of the time, and in what they're saying. They specifically talk about Negroes, raping white women. But in the representations, that was a step too far. They could never actually show a black man with a white woman. So you have more of the scummy white drug dealer being represented, or represented as the devil. There's countless instances of this in the advertising imagery of the time. So that was during the 1930s and the 1940s, and then in the 1950s, the discourse shifted towards the toxicomaniac. That the cannabis user would become a heroin addict. Anslinger basically created the gateway theory. That term was invented by him, and it's still in use today, the idea that cannabis leads on to harder drugs, which is actually not true. There's nothing in the compound that would cause you to experiment with another drug. It might just be it's more the black market where hard and soft drugs are sold at the same places. And that's as a result of prohibition, not as a result of the drug itself. So then the 1950s, you have the presentation of the beat generation, the rebel, the loser, who's going nowhere in society. In the 1960s, this kind of behavior was, again, very difficult for conservative white society to accept. What were these people doing? There's also racial intermingling again, and the reaction to that was to criminalize cannabis use. This was under the auspices of Nixon, and he had his own bone to pick with the peaceniks because they were opposing his war in Vietnam. So again, the representation of the cannabis user is the outsider, the deviant. In the 1970s, the parody of it actually, like life imitates art, imitates life again. These are two comedians parodying the mainstream perception of what a cannabis user is, but then it actually becomes the real representation in that time of what cannabis users, I guess, were. I guess they adopted this as an emblem of their resistance in a way. So at the same time that this film was being made, you've got this guy smoking, the roof down in Hawaii. That's young Barry Obama, who was he was then also president. He was the president of the Choom Gang. I don't know how many of you know how much weed this guy actually smoked when he was growing up in the 1970s, but he was notorious for mooching weed off people. And at the same time, you're getting the kind of the Cheech and Chong representation of the stoner. You're getting this representation from advertising of how wholesome tobacco use is, and the nature discourses are coursing through it. Then you've got also, I don't want to get into too much detail about it, but let me move on to the discourses around alcohol. Again, very positive discourses. You've got this very wholesome young lady playing the accordion, an angelic lady playing the harp, and of course it's just another form of drug use being represented in a very positive light by the mainstream media. So this video explains that the exportation of alcohol use from northern European countries.
For alcohol, as drugs go, probably has the most external harm out of any of them. in that there's just so much grief caused to people who don't use it. And then you have, of course, the harm to the user themselves, with like liver damage, brain damage, heart disease.
So it's a major drug problem, and yet it's not seen by the average Kiwi as being a drug. It's just something to have fun with.
Most countries in the world, cannabis is illegal, whereas alcohol is legal. And why should that be? And I have to say, it doesn't make sense scientifically. So the explanation, of course, is historic.
Marijuana is not a Western world product. Therefore, it's not liked. Alcohol is, so alcohol is legal.
The northern European countries didn't have cannabis in the Middle Ages, so they developed a culture based around alcohol. But then, of course, the northern European immigration to the rest of the world, like here, brought that culture, the alcohol culture, everywhere, and that became the norm, the standard culture. And then drinks manufacturers were already hugely powerful, and they've become even more powerful. Well, clearly, the whole social attitude to cannabis vis-a-vis alcohol and tobacco is completely hypocritical. And it's driven by a mixture of ignorance and prejudice and historical traditions, but also enormous amount of commercial pressure, particularly by the drinks industry.
Annually, liquor companies are making profits of about $12 billion a year. But the cost to taxpayers from damages caused by alcohol is about $16 billion a year. And Peter Dunn is protecting the interests of this industry, which is leaving the country with a massive financial burden.
Historically, Northern European cultures basically exported the alcohol drug culture to most of the world, and they excluded the use of things like cannabis, which were associated with brown and black people. And so the alcohol culture is actually really an expression of white Northern European culture, and everyone on Earth is really touched by it in some way. I mean, you have alcohol use in tribal cultures that never had alcohol use before, and it's much to their detriment because genetically they're not predisposed towards handling the drug, and so it can cause a lot of havoc. But anyway, alcohol culture, alcohol drug culture, you say yes to that, but you say no to all of these other cultures, and this is where advertising and news converge, because the Reagans, through their Just Say No campaign, they were making the news into an advert for their policies. All the while, Reagan was taking massive handouts from pharmaceutical companies and alcohol companies. Before that, he was actually a salesman for the tobacco companies.
Tonight on Headline News, President Carter proposes major changes to federal drug laws.
I support a change in law to end federal criminal penalties for possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana.
McGruff here. I want you to learn a song that tells people to say no to drugs. Users are losers and losers are users. So don't use drugs. Don't use drugs. Winners don't use.
Just say no.
Just say no. Say no. Drugs. Don't use drugs. If you know a user even part of the time, tell them to quit, take your bite out of crime. Users are losers and losers are users. So don't use drugs. Don't use drugs. Okay, everybody.
If you do drugs, you will be caught. And when you're caught, you will be punished.
Users are losers and losers are users.
Some think there won't be room for them in jail. We'll make room.
Nice going. Now teach it to your mom and dad and brothers and sisters and friends to help take a bite out of crime. Use drugs.
So when we say no to drugs, it'll be clear that we mean absolutely none.
This portion of Inauguration Day is sponsored by Comtrex, the multi-symptom cold reliever.
Execute the office of President of the United States.
So you get the picture there. Just say no to some drugs and say yes to alcohol, tobacco, and pharmaceuticals, the legal drugs that Reagan was actually benefiting from financially. So the Reagans created this Just Say No campaign, and out of that was spawned McGruff the Crime Dog, whose little anthem you just heard. What's happened to McGruff the Crime Dog? Well, the actor who played McGruff the crime dog and who was appearing up until last year at ball games to toss out the opening pitch and at schools to tell the kids to just say no to drugs, was caught with 16,000 weed plants in basically a fortress, a weed fortress that was guarded by grenade launchers, fully automatic weapons, 5,000 rounds of ammunition. This guy was a hardcore gangster. And he was the one telling your children and children around the world to say no to drugs. So he's been charged, convicted, sentenced to 16 years. McGruff the crime dog, just say no. So if you want to look this up online, McGruff the crime dog, he wasn't just a drug dealer, he was actually a drug kingpin, as this headline points out. Now, what happens when that sort of contradicts the whole narrative, you don't hear about that. You know, that story doesn't confirm the themes that they want to push. So you have to look on alternate sources of news to find out about McGruff the crime dog. And when it does hit the news, it's basically, I think the process that kicks into overdrive is to shame the offender, particularly if he's perceived to be a hero beforehand. The rational reaction to a story like Michael Phelps being exposed as a weekend stoner would be, oh, we must have been wrong about stoners being losers because this contradicts all of our entire position. But instead of saying, oh no, we're wrong, we apologize for mischaracterizing drug use, basically they have to characterize him as a dope, as being stupid, force him into apologizing, which he did much to his own embarrassment. So that's how drug use is treated amongst the celebrity class when it contradicts the official narrative. And just to give you a cartoon representation of that.
You know, Peter, it's sort of adding insult to injury raiding Quagmire's fridge for beer after you killed his cat.
Or is it? Is my response. Ah, crap. God, I hate cops. Almost as much as I hated my overly sensitive car alarm.
What do we got, partner?
Empty alcohol containers, the driver is inebriated and covered in blood, he's got scratches on his face and arms, there's a blood-soaked corpse in the back seat, got shovels in there, and a hand-drawn map titled, "This is where we'll hide the body."
Well, that all seems fine. Sorry to bother you, sir.
Pot! Small amount of pot! You're under arrest, dirtbag! Oh, come on!
I don't appreciate drug addicts in my town. I'm a family guy. He said it!
This is a scene from Druglawed, and I'll explain why I've included it afterwards.
Currently, I'm on pain relief that I don't agree with, I don't like. It's extremely dangerous. I really believe in cannabis as a medication, which historically, with me being partly trained as a pharmacist, I'm having it sitting on my shelves in the old days. I'm comfortable with thinking of cannabis as a medicine and always have thought of it that way. This is my monitor for while I'm on home detention. I've got a year sentence of home detention. The whole thing is so ridiculous. I was extremely angry when cannabis was removed from my life forcibly, and I kept ranting at doctors and nurses about what I need and what I want as cannabis. I trust it as pain relief, and they listened to me and agreed with me.
Really gentle, wonderful person. She was... Okay, so this is how she was characterized after being arrested, after the police tampered with evidence to embellish the charges against her to try and seize her home under the Proceeds of Crimes Act. They even planted evidence, made up a story that she was a dealer, completely false. She'd never sold cannabis to anyone. She was growing it for herself and her boarder, who were both elderly and had pain conditions that the cannabis helped with. So that was the truth. I showed you the video so you could see the lady who's now being characterized not as the granny, as the ganja granny. It's actually been misspelled to say ganga, granny ganga, to imply that she had these gang affiliations, which were absolutely untrue. I stayed with her for a week. I lived with her in Pyro and got to know her then. And it's basically the media just running with this criminal theme, the criminal narrative. So, and also the deviant narrative as well, that she's disobeying the edicts of society by growing a few plants for herself and her daughter's chronic pain. So those three discourses are often collapsed. You know, it's now 2015, and we've got the criminality and the insanity discourses, cannabis risk in one joint, you'll go psycho from one joint, and it's now being collapsed into the discourse of criminal insanity, and even the third discourse of laziness is in this one recent example of one of the Paris bombers, or alleged Paris bombers, has been characterized in the media as being a lazy pothead. So, you know, he possibly was a lazy pothead, I don't know. It's more about why they are seizing on that. If one of them was on prescription medication, why aren't we hearing about that? If one of them was an alcohol user, why aren't we hearing about that? Probably there was some other drug use, but we're not really hearing about the legal drugs. It's more the illegal drugs that will now splash into the headlines and again feed into the discourse. All three discourses, the loser, the criminal, and the deviant, are all in the story. And how to combat these misrepresentations is to present positive representation. So this is Cheryl Schumann, who's a very successful PR manager in Hollywood, and she's got a number of businesses. She's now the star of a reality TV show, and I think that's a way of throwing light on the erroneous discourses by saying, no, this is actually what people who use cannabis are like. They're really successful, like Michael Phelps. Instead of mischaracterizing him, why don't you concentrate on how you were wrong about drug use and saying, wow, you can smoke weed and be the greatest Olympian of all time. This is Mason Tvert, who led the Safer campaign in Colorado. I guess he's the one who essentially legalized weed in Colorado, and you can see how well presented he is. He's very articulate. He looks like a businessman, and those are the kinds of images that need to be presented in order to question those discourses that we've been fed in the last 80 to 100 years. Also, normalizing drug use is really important in terms of presenting it as just an everyday thing that people do. It doesn't drive them insane. It doesn't cause them to harm themselves or stop going to work, much as the use of legal drugs doesn't do that. And you can point out that people who are on Adderall are actually on exactly the same compound as methamphetamine, but their use of Adderall is normal and accepted, and the use of methamphetamine is deviant, is criminal. But you can see the difference in the chemical structure is one hydrogen molecule. So then you've also got these iterations of drug use which are ambivalent in terms of are they helping or are they hurting? In a case like Zach Galifianakis, I'd say yes. He fired up a joint on Bill Maher's Real Time, and I'd say yep, that's great. That's a good instance of it. Willie Nelson, great representation of the very successful stoner who's in his 80s and probably smokes more weed than small countries. I think he's one of the greatest Grammy Award winners of all time. I think he's won just about more Grammys for country music than any other country singer. And then you get these kind of I'm not liking this. I don't mind pop culture and stuff, but Snoop, yeah, I'm on the fence about Snoop. But when you've got Miley, who's probably really is a little bit deviant, not that I mind that, but if she's representing cannabis, I see it as problematic. Not that she can do whatever she wants to on stage, but she's not a good representative for questioning the discourses of, deviance in this case. Like, go ahead, Miley, I don't mind your music, I don't mind you, but I don't want her representing me in this instance. So these are the people I do want to represent me, and one of them, Cheryl Schumann, who I talked about earlier, Rafael Meshulam, who I interviewed in Israel, and these are and Jose Mujica, the former president of Uruguay, who's the one who essentially legalized it for the first time on a national scale. Not that he is a drug user himself. In fact, only Cheryl Schumann is the only actual cannabis user of this caste. But those are the kinds of positive iterations that I think will help question the thematic discourses that we've been fed before.
Michael, thanks for yesterday and today.
Sure.
Just in relation to the influence of the media, in relation to forming public opinion around, certain discourses, what accountability is there for media to tell the truth? We saw on your video that, Granny was said to be a drug dealer, for instance. That's clearly false. So what sort of accountabilities exist in the media in terms of forming public opinion that's accurate?
There is none. They're never brought to book. They can say what they like, and if they're wrong, they may or may not issue a correction, but they usually don't. They usually will never acknowledge with it. They never said that about Dawn. In fact, that was just one instance. There was a television interview which misrepresented her really badly. So there's nothing to really punish them for doing that, which is quite depressing.
Yeah, most people believe what they see and read in the media.
Yeah.
It's very unfortunate. It'd be nice if there was some more accountability somehow. It's just an ideal, I suppose, but if people are more aware of what they see is just entertainment and propaganda, it would make a difference.
It would. Occasionally there's like a crackdown like there was on News of the World, but you'd have to, in that instance, it was an egregious transgression. They committed, multiple crimes against hundreds, possibly thousands of people, for there to be punishment of that newspaper for doing something unethical. So it's a hardly ever situation where there are consequences.
Thank you.
Sure. Oh, the smuggler. Okay, sure. Well, this is actually not his real face in the poster. It's someone who looks like him, and he wouldn't give me permission to use his real face yet because he could be killed by his former associates. His real name, I'll tell you, I'll use a name that he has used, Paramaransa Das. And the reason I don't want to give his real name is the same reason. And he opened the newspaper one day about 18 months ago. He bought the newspaper, going on his merry way about his day. He thought his life was back to normal. And he buys the newspaper, and he's all over the front page. The entire front page and page 3, half of page 3, were all about his international smuggling ring. And he'd served his time for it. He'd served 14 years in California, in Shasta County Jail. He was arrested by the DEA after a long investigation. They made the critical mistake of smuggling weed to the US. They'd never done that before. They'd smuggled weed through multiple countries across 3 continents. And they'd always said, we're never going to sell it in the US because then we can be indicted there, and elsewhere we can serve 5 to 10, but in the US they could serve life. And so the DEA cut him a deal. They said, you'll serve 16 years and you'll work for us. And it was either that or life imprisonment. So he served 14 years and he acted as an informant for them. But he was giving them false information. So he would give them half the story and then mislead them the other half so that they couldn't actually use the information that he was giving them. But of course, his former partners don't know that. And if they see this movie and they don't listen to that little detail that I've just told you, they'd send someone to kill him. So he's trying to sort things out so that he's protected as much as he can when the information is revealed. You know, his former partners, if they became aware through the instances of the story being on the internet, which it has been, because the New Zealand Herald, which ran that front page story, has also published it online. So, you know, these guys who he worked for could see that and come after him. But of course, a film is much more high profile, you know, so I wouldn't say he fears for his life at this stage, but he has to take precautions. Yeah. Hi.
Yeah, thanks very much for the presentation. I just wanted to take issue actually with one thing you were saying, which was that you are not in favor of a kind of confirmation of the deviant image associated with marijuana.
Yeah.
And I would be cautious at sort of setting oneself up as an arbiter of what is normal and what is deviant.
Yeah,
of course,
yeah.
you can make a reading of the way these things are read in turn by 60 Minutes or whatever, the sort of authority figure that we kind of imagine and see as sort of attempting to control the mainstream's mind. But I would have thought, for example, getting a bunch of people up together, some who are in ties and some who fit, you know, the Jimi Hendrix stereotype or the, you know, whatever it is, getting them up together and speaking maybe in one voice and saying, look, because I think in some sense you don't want to, I feel like one doesn't want to take these substances, in this case marijuana, and say, look, this doesn't change anything. This won't change anything. I mean, in a sense, there's a utopian potential connected to them. And part of that is that people can sense, yes, we can free ourselves from the straitjacket. And there has to be space for that as well as the space for saying that there's a medicinal aspect and so on. Just a comment, really.
Yeah. No, I would. I agree and I disagree. I'm putting the hat of the conservative reader on and saying this doesn't help. I'm all in favor of artistic expression. And so there I say, yeah, go Miley and do whatever you want on stage. You're the artist and you have total freedom to do so. Where I have a reservation is that she might be using an issue that has very serious ramifications for her own image management, to say, I am the rebel, I smoke weed, I'm in your face about it because I'm so badass. There you're adopting a position of a spokesperson, and so in doing so you have to do it responsibly.
Well, no, you don't actually.
You don't? Oh, okay.
You don't have to be. I mean, and expecting responsibility from someone like her. I mean, you're asking a lot.
Yeah. Well, it's like a case of should we be worried about feeding discourses that are mischaracterizing the population of cannabis users? We should be. And we also shouldn't care. We shouldn't care because it's out of our control, and we should care because at the end of the day it will affect the final form that legalization takes. And if Miley, like, let me give you an example, a concrete example. The recent vote in Ohio was to legalize cannabis, but to create a cannabis monopoly. And a bunch of reality TV stars and media people funded this initiative and made sure that the 10 companies that would be given the monopoly were owned by themselves, which would have made them multi-billionaires in a few years. And in that instance, they were using their media strength, their position in the media, to advocate for on their own behalves. And there I say, well, thank goodness that vote failed, because that would have created a system which excludes the cannabis user even more, you know, from production of his or her own drug, and enrich, you know, this little cabal of media personalities. So, you know, I'm not saying Miley is involved in this kind of thing, but there are others like her, you know, of that level, with the same kind of media strength, who can then go, here's an opportunity for me to make money. And in those instances, we really have to fight back quite hard. So yeah, with the Miley, look, I'm in favor of, I'm on the fence. I'm like, yeah, I'm all in favor of free expression. But if you're talking about a serious issue, be respectful, I guess I'm just saying, you know. Yeah, but she's going to say whatever she's going to say, and people like that are going to say whatever they're going to say. So yeah, but I do take your point. Hi.
Arik, on behalf of EGA Melbourne and everybody here, I'd just like to thank you so much for coming all the way from New Zealand and showing your film and speaking to us today. It's wonderful, and
thank you.
I'd ask everybody just to show your thanks. Thank you.
Thanks very much.